Taking full advantage of the recent advances, the Russians continued offensive operations towards the highway supplying Hulyaipole from the north. The Russians managed to capture Danilivka, which cuts off the highway from Pokrosk, and at the same time they're expanding the offensive operations to the south of Danilivka, to the west of Sqkm and Rivnopilya towards the highway from the eastern direction, and down south along the fortified positions, gaining control over the defensive line on the northern flank of Vesele, Seleniahai and Vysoke, while at the same time advancing from the eastern direction. To the south of this, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Seleniahai and Vysoke. The Russians are here advancing along the forest lines towards the settlements from the south and from the east. The three settlements of Vesele, Seleniahai and Vysoke are all three small settlements. There is a few fortifications within Seleniahai, while Vysoke is barely fortified and Vesele has no fortifications. However, they act together as a combined defensive zone, with the river line to the south acting as a natural barrier, the fortifications to the southeast, Seleniahai on the northern flank, and Vesele facing off in the eastern direction. The defense to the north was the first line of defense. However, with the Russian push through the first line of defense, the Russians can now attack Vesele from its weak point, that is the northern flank, to enter into it, and then attack Seleniahai from its weak point from the northwest. Combining these two, the Russians can gain control over the northern flank of Vysoke, and then again attacking it from its weak point through the north. Therefore, the Russians can completely bypass the defenses of these three settlements by attacking them from their weak point, and at the same time for some forces through the east to keep the Ukrainian forces on the eastern flank. If they redirect their forces to the north, then the Russians can attack from the eastern flank, and if they redirect their forces to the east, then the Russians can flank from the north. If they split up their forces, then the Russians can concentrate their own forces in one of these two directions. Therefore, the Russians have the initiative and the advantage with this flanking maneuver. Gaining control of these three settlements will open the road towards Zatishya from the east. However, the defensive line is still present. That is why the advance to the north of this is as significant as it is. The Russians gain control of a large portion of the first line of defense and can continue offensive operations through Yablokova in the north, down towards Zatishya from the northern flank, bypassing the fortifications and flanking them from the weak point to gain control over the fortifications and thereby attacking Zatishya from its vulnerable flank. As for the advances in the western direction, it is as I reported in my previous video, the Russians would look to push through the first lines, gain control over the vast area here west of the Yancha River, and reach to the outskirts of the positions here along the highway. This is to strike any of the Ukrainian forces moving along the highway, whether it's from Hulyaipole in the northern direction or down south. It also forces the Ukrainians to man the entire defensive line, rather than concentrate their forces in the north to prevent further Russian advances along the defensive line. So this spreads out the Ukrainian defensive capabilities, rather than concentrating them in one area, exactly the same as Vesele to Vysoke, however on a much larger scale. As for the advance through Danilivka, the Russians have gained full control over the settlements here along the southern bank of the Yancha River, as they continue offensive operations alongside it. With the control over Danilivka and a push towards Hai, the Russians can then flank Vidratne from the eastern flank and flank the fortifications from the weak point, that is the northern flank, and with control over the southern flank, the Ukrainians would be operationally encircled and would have to withdraw westwards along the second defensive line or risk complete encirclement by the Russian forces to the north, cutting off the northern highway, and from the south, cutting off the southern highway. The Russian advances in this section of the front line from Orestopil in the north to Vysoke in the south through this month is approximately 130 square kilometers, of which the 60 kilometers, about half of it, was this update and the last update. This just shows how much the Russians have been advancing over the past 2 days, and this comes following the announcement by the group of forces operating in this direction that they would launch a new offensive. The Russians are currently advancing about 1 kilometer in a straight line every day, and some reports suggest that if the Russians are able to gain control over Hulyaipole and the eastern flank of the defensive line, they can significantly speed up those advances beyond 1 kilometer all the way up to 10 kilometers a day. Although I doubt that could happen unless the Russians significantly improve the logistics of their forces in the area with the capture of Pokrosk, Novopavlivka, Myshova, and Slovianka in the east, as well as Pokrosk and Hulyaipole in the west. At that point, it would be possible by pushing in the direction of Dnipro city, Pavlograd, and the rear of Zaporizhia until they reach the next defensive lines. A Russian offensive into the Dnipropetrovsk region and the rear of Zaporizhia is becoming increasingly likely. The Russian pressure on Hulyaipole is enormous. With the push along the supply line leading into Hulyaipole, the Russians can start targeting the supply lines leading into the city and significantly limit what goes in and begin a siege of it. Hulyaipole is much smaller than Pokrosk and way less connected than Pokrosk, which means that the Russians would be able to gain control over the city much quicker, especially since the Russians have a large concentration of the forces in this direction despite the limited logistics, and the Ukrainians are struggling to fully man the fortifications. This means if the Russians are able to continue and the Ukrainians do not send reinforcements similar to the breach in the Dnipropetrovsk direction north of Pokrovsk and Mynarad, then the Russians can advance much more than they did in the Dnipropetrovsk direction, especially since they have much more forces, there are less fortifications, and the Ukrainians, without the reinforcements, the Russians would have advanced way beyond what they did on the northern flank of Mynarad. So we'll have to see how Ukraine reacts to this, if they're able to react to it, as simultaneously to this, the Russians are gaining full control over the Pokrosk direction. Moving on to the Pokrosk direction, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Reshine, getting control over the remaining parts of the fortifications here on the western flank and advancing along the road towards the next fortifications, with additional advances along the road from Pokrovsk up towards Reshine from the southeast. The Russians are here working through the fortifications, passing through, gaining control over the first lines leading up to the town, and slowly building up their forces for a push into it. The Russians have now started contesting the town. As for the northeast of Pokrosk, the Ukrainians weren't the only ones who took advantage of the fog. The Russians sent reinforcements to the city and were able to recapture the southern parts of it. The Russians are here pushing up through the apartment complex buildings to gain full control over the city in a counterattack from the south. With this, the Russians are strengthening their counterattack operations to prevent the Ukrainians from regaining control over the city, solidify their hold over it, while they consolidate their possessions within Pokrovsk and beyond it, as they start offensive operations towards Reshine in the west and Mynarad in the east. The Russians are now solidifying their control over the city, having closed many of the pockets over the past 48 hours. The Russian forces are now moving up north towards the northern flank, where they will start fighting over the Dacha area that completely closes the Mynarad pocket, and the Dacha area on the northwest of Pokrovsk, where the Russians will then have 100% control over the city, and the reinforcements that came along the highway has significantly strengthened the Russian concentration of forces within it for offensive operations beyond it. If the Russians are able to expand their offensive operations beyond Pokrovsk to gain control over the defensive line north of it and regain full control over Rodinsk, the Russians will be able to advance from the northern road towards Reshine as well, or through the city up towards it from that road, and at the same time connect their forces with Rodinsk in the north and advance along the highway towards Belitske, which is a similar sized city to Rodinsk, and the northwest towards Shevchenko along the defensive lines, gain control over the fortifications and move on beyond the city up towards Dnipropetrovsk, and at the same time consolidate their positions within Mynarad and Pokrosk, establish them as logistical hubs for their own forces, and expand offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region in the northwest and Dnipropetrovsk in the north, as well as the northeastern direction along the defensive lines up towards Sqkm and the flank of the Kostyantynivka-Sloviansk line. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.